Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Tom Koulopoulos. Tom is the chairman of the Delphi Group, a 30-year-old Boston think tank and technology management advisory firm. He is the author of 12 books and speaks globally and writes on social, organizational, and human impact of technology. His newest book, and an incredibly timely one at that, is Reimagining Healthcare, How the Smartsourcing Revolution Will Drive the Future of Healthcare and Refocus It on What Matters Most, the Patient. Tom, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Howard, thank you for having me.
Well, I hope wherever you are on the Eastern Seaboard, you are doing well and safe.
We're hanging in there. That's the term we're all using lately. We're hanging in there.
We certainly are. And besides the quarantine and COVID-19, then we have other issues kind of layered on top. And it just,
yes.
I think we're going to look for 2020 to be, I forget about that year. So I was excited when I was introduced to you and this book on reimagining healthcare. And I would love just if you could just first share a little bit of background about yourself, because you've got you're a prolific author. You've got some great focus on what your organization, the Delphi Group, is doing. But share with our audience, if you will, before we dive into the book, a little bit of background about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Howard. My original roots were very, very heavily steeped in technology. I came out of school being a programmer, developer for many years. But what I increasingly realized was that the benefit of technology and the challenge of technology was ultimately the human element. So I began to shift my focus more and more to how does technology impact our own personal behaviors and our organizational behaviors, our social behaviors. And the Delphi Group was founded to create a place where we could think about those issues in a very deep way and identify where technology and humanity sort of collide. And we've worked with all kinds of large organizations, Fortune 500 organizations. We've worked with nation states. And in every case, we're brought in to help them understand the implications of technology on workers, on customers, on constituents. And it's a fun thing to do. I love to look at that aspect of technology because all too often we get wrapped up in sort of the weeds of technology, the gadgets. But at the end of the day, look at your iPhone, what that thing has transformed as society. It's not just a technology, it's a behavior. And that's what we focus on. We focus on behavioral issues. And that's why healthcare became such an important topic for me, because I think at this point in time, and who could have predicted what 2020 would bring? But even before that, healthcare was an area of deep concern for me and so many people because it has such direct implications to every single one of us. None of us are immune from that industry and its efficiency and how well it operates.
I'm curious about a whole number of things related to this topic, but pre-COVID-19, there's a constant focus on the inefficiencies of the hospital systems, even in major cities, at least. I know for a fact out in the communities, those community hospitals, they're either not making any money at all or barely making money. I think you said like in the low one figures, whatever that might be, or they're closing altogether. So there is no access to healthcare. I've got to drive 50, 60 miles or more for a treatment.
Yeah, and that's a big concern that I have, Howard, is because as a result of, and we can come back and talk more about the implications of COVID on healthcare, but one of the big implications is going to be on that rural and community healthcare system. Those hospitals were barely getting by to begin with. They were running on 2-3% margins. And what COVID has done, and I think one thing we can look at with in a positive light, and we've celebrated it and we should celebrate it more, is that it's not the clinicians. They're not the ones at fault. The doctors, the nurses, the clinicians are doing everything they can. They're dedicated to their profession. No one becomes a doctor or a nurse strictly for the money. They do it because they have a passion in caring for people. And we've seen that as a result of COVID-19. My concern is that long term, because the enormous administrative burden on these hospitals, a lot of these community and rural hospitals will have to shut down, Howard. And that's going to create what I call deserts of healthcare, where you not only have to drive 50 miles, but maybe 200 miles to get reasonable healthcare. And that has enormous implications on us as a nation and all of us individually as well. And let's say COVID calls at least a wake-up call to look at what has been, not to be too colloquial, but a pre-existing condition in healthcare. It has been burdened with enormous administrative overhead, and we have to somehow allow the clinicians to focus on what they do well, which is to care for us as the patients, and move that administrative burden elsewhere. There really is no other solution.
In your book, Reimagining Healthcare, how do you have conversations with the healthcare entities, the government, the countries, the regulators? Where do you start to have that conversation to say enough is enough? COVID-19, as an example, has really laid bare all of the inefficiencies that are there. They're now viewable to the public at large. Where do we start to make that shift to disrupt, but disrupt in a good way?
Yeah. So that's been the question in healthcare for some time, right? The concern is that it's such a complex problem. There are so many stakeholders, the regulators, the administrators, the clinicians, the government, that it's difficult to find a place to start. But the premise I have in the book is a very simple one. I think we have to keep it simple to be able to address the problem in the near term. And my premise is that and this is, by the way, this is not just my number. This is widely acknowledged as the number. 30% of healthcare dollars go to administration. They go to claims processing, to billing, to all the things that we as patients despise, and which make it difficult for the doctor or the nurse to do his or her job. So my premise is, let's attack the administrative burden. Is there a way that we can chip away at that? Policy should follow. We have to have regulation in healthcare. There's no doubt about that. We have to have a political discussion about this. But right now, the social political discussion mires us. It divides us, and it makes progress nearly impossible. Not that we haven't made some progress in the past, we have, but the real progress right now is to chip away that 30%. And what amazed me was that when I began to go out and talk to hospitals, they instantly fell into one of three buckets. Those that simply didn't know how to get rid of that administrative burden. They didn't know where to begin that process. Those who were purely outsourcing it, trying to let someone else do the job for them, but at arm's length, who didn't really have a vested stake in the hospital or the provider. And third, those that were doing what I call smart sourcing. And that third category was making enormous advances in terms of both their bottom line, in terms of healthcare efficacy and outcomes, and also in terms of their ability to serve their population, their patients well. And I use some examples in the book of these hospitals that took the smart sourcing approach. So I began to ask myself the question, why aren't more hospitals looking at getting rid of that administration, partnering with someone who knows the administrative side of healthcare intimately well, is willing to truly partner with the hospital, to be in it together, to have skin in the game? And the answer was that a lot of these hospitals simply don't realize that the model exists. They don't see it as an option. So the point of the book is to try to raise awareness around that. It's being done. There are success stories right now. I talk about John Muir Health at length in the book. There are success stories that show it can be done. And within 10 years, I think we could make enormous changes to healthcare that would make it much more effective, much more cost effective, much more efficient, and much more pleasant for us as patients, frankly.
Does this ability to smart source extend to the private or for-profit hospital down to the community hospital, assuming that they're still existing?
Yeah, absolutely. Because they all have, every one of these hospitals struggles with the administrative burden. There is one thing I point out in the book, which is really important to understand here, and few people truly appreciate this aspect of healthcare. The large hospitals, the really large hospital systems, what I call them the mega hospitals, they have this very perverse economic dynamic that's very different from the community or the rural hospitals or the smaller providers. And that is that because they're so large, their economies of scale actually work against the consumer/patient. And here's how that happens. Their size allows them to negotiate much higher reimbursement rates with the insurers, and therefore they drive costs up. And I now, as a consumer, have to pay more in my deductibles and my copays as a result of that. So it's the only industry I know of where economies of scale, large providers that should be driving down the cost of the consumer actually drive up the cost for the consumer. So I think being able to look at every aspect of healthcare, from the large mega hospitals to the small rural providers, is essential, because they all suffer from this same administrative burden. To a large degree, that ends up being the single biggest culprit, I think, in the healthcare system.
Well, what are some of the examples of the smart sourcing that we can do or put in place to kind of help these hospitals kind of change this behavior?
So everyone now is talking about digital transformation, moving to digital platforms to run their businesses. While there's a lot of digital technology in the healthcare system, unfortunately, much of it is very fragmented, very, very disconnected. It exists in silos. So simple things like your medical record can't easily be shared, even within a single provider, much less across multiple providers. So one of the first areas where we could focus Smartsourcing is on managing that data piece of healthcare. Not just healthcare records, but the billings and the claims. So much of healthcare comes down to who pays for it. And the majority of personal bankruptcies are attributed in large part to healthcare costs. So I think focusing on how we can better manage that piece of healthcare, the data piece of healthcare, will drive down costs pretty significantly. So go back to John Muir Healthcare in Northern California. Part of what they do, is with every other hospital, is they have an IT organization. And that IT organization was part of John Muir Health. The problem is that, imagine this now, you're in Northern California, you're competing for IT talent. You've got Google and Apple and Microsoft and God knows who else in Silicon Valley, all competing for the same talent. What are you likely to get? And what kind of career path can you give those folks? So obviously, you won't get the sort of talent you need. However, a Smartsourcing provider, a large entity that has its own IT organization that can provide that career path, that excellence in different areas, like cybersecurity, for example, can do the job much, much better. Here's the thing, though. When John Muir Health did partner with Optum, who was their Smartsourcing provider, to do this, they didn't fire all their IT people. They rebadged them. So the IT people are still at John Muir Health. They're still part of that organization. They just happen to work for and get their paycheck from Optum. And most people see that and say, what a strange kind of construct. But that is the future. That is the way organizations are partnering in order to maintain some ability to innovate in every area of the organization and innovate in a way that supports their core. If you just outsource and give all that to someone else, they don't get your business. They don't focus on your core competencies and helping you to innovate there. Whereas in the Smartsourcing relationship, you do have the ability to innovate across the board and still innovate in your core. So a very different type of construct that most people aren't familiar with.
It's interesting. In an early life, a very early life before I went into coaching, I worked for firms like Electronic Data Systems and
Sure.
Science Corporation. And it seems to me some of those models, or the contracts they had with some of their clients, were perhaps leaning towards some of that smart sourcing. And so it's a very interesting model. How does the public's perception, the administrator's perception change, knowing that we're going to hand some of this responsibility off? I mean, like I said, the staff they're still there. They're going to get rebadged. But now, is there a perception that hey, we're going to lose control if we don't manage everything ourselves?
So there absolutely is that perception. And I'm glad you touched on that, because that is what prevents a lot of hospitals from moving in that direction. They feel the loss of control. And think about this. I mean, if you think about it logically, it makes a lot of sense. If you're a small hospital, you've got very slim margins. You've got this, behemoth thing, called claims and billing. They call it revenue cycle in healthcare. A lot of administrators, very complex. You're barely able to figure it out on your own. You've got people that have been doing it for years and years. The last thing you want to do is move that to someone else. There's enormous risk in doing that. And the reason that risk, there's perceived risk anyway, the reason that risk exists in perception is because it hasn't been done enough. If it had been done in enough other cases, then every hospital would say, of course, we'll do it as well. So we're still in the early stage, I think, of understanding how Smartsourcing will work. But the examples are beginning to make themselves known. And that's in large part why I wrote the book. I was looking at healthcare in terms of, is there some lever here that we can move to have a significant impact without getting mired in the politics and the regulation? And as I looked closer and closer, it became obvious to me that administrative piece, which is hidden in plain sight, we all know it exists, is the piece that we haven't chipped away at. And the hospitals themselves are reluctant in many cases to do that because they fear the risk of bringing it, taking that and giving it to someone else and losing control. In reality, what they're doing is letting someone else do the job who can do it much, much better than they can, and taking the headache away from them and allowing hospitals to do what they should be doing, which is focusing on care. That's what hospitals are really good at.
So now that we know the 20,000-pound gorilla in the room, how do we begin to frequently, consistently have this conversation to educate, to inform these hospital systems that there is a newer, better way?
So two answers to that. First, when you talk about the 200-pound gorilla, or whatever metaphor we want to use, a good friend of mine is a CIO at a local healthcare system in Boston. When I was writing the book, I chatted with him and he said, you know what, Tom, we all know who the elephant is in the room. We can all see the elephant. We all throw peanuts at him, but we can't get the damn thing to move. So this notion of hidden in plain sight is always fascinated me when it came to healthcare, because we all kind of know what the problem is. And look, we're not all doctors, we're not all nurses or clinicians, but we're all patients. We all understand what it is about healthcare that frustrates us. We all realize that when we walk into our doctor's office and get 5 or 10 minutes with him or her, they're probably going to spend another 10 minutes afterwards, updating our health records and trying to work on the data side of patient care, as opposed to being with us for 20 minutes, which would make a huge difference, I think, for us as patients. So, first part of the answer to your question is we all know the elephant is in the room. So the problem is obvious. What do we do about that obvious problem? And look, I think here, if I take any other industry as an example, we have to build examples that we talk about broadly and widely. And that's the point of the book. I don't want to talk about the future in some hypothetical sense. I want to show that it's here. And I have example after example in the book of where it's being done, of how it's being done, and frankly, of the courage it will take on the part of hospital leadership. Cal Knight, who's the CEO over at John Muir Health, incredible individual. And when you talk to the leaders of these organizations, you can tell which ones really do understand the value of smart sourcing. And those are the ones that, frankly, are going to be the role models long term for how this is done. But you only do it through role model and through experience, Howard. I've seen no other way that it can be done in any other industry.
Very good. And you bring up a question for me is, when you talked about the CEO, John Muir, is there a shift in mindset for the leaders of these systems? Is there some coaching, development that has to take place to, because we can look at the data. You have the data. You've been doing the research, but again, there's still, how do we get that elephant in the move? Is there a mindset shift that we have to help them address?
So in the book, one stat I have in the book is that 70% of the hospital leaders, provider leaders that have been surveyed say that they understand the problem. They know what the problem is, and they want to do something about it. About 20% say that they are doing anything about it. So I think a lot of these leaders feel shackled. So is there room for coaching? Is there room for sharing of information and for providing some knowledge that maybe isn't as widely shared as it should be? Yes, absolutely. But the only way that works for leaders is when it comes from other leaders. I think that is, again, in any industry I look at that I've worked with, that's always the case, that leaders will look to other leaders to understand, how did they mitigate the risk? How did they deal with the cultural issues? How did they deal with the financial issues of partnering with an organization that intimately? A lot of these smart sourcing partnerships, by the way, they actually build a separate entity, and both the provider and the partner have a vested interest in that separate entity. So there's a lot of complexity to how this happens, and you need to have a leader actually walk you through what they've done, what he or she has done first. And I think we're at the very early stages of that. But some of these leaders, like Cal Knight, are making it known that there is a way forward. And that, Howard, that to me is the most important message in this book. There is a way forward. We can turn healthcare around in the next 10 years, not only to make it better in the US, but quite literally to make it the standard for the entire world. And when people hear that, they instantly react very negatively. How could that possibly be? So here's what's going on. We haven't talked about this, that global demographics are aging rapidly across the world. And when I sat down and looked at this, and I talk about it in the book, no healthcare system anywhere in the world, national, universal healthcare, I don't care where you go to, from Japan to Finland to Germany, is going to withstand the aging population. We are outgrowing our healthcare system. We're getting too old for our healthcare system. And COVID showed that. Because what did COVID do? It attacked the most vulnerable piece of that demographic, the older elder community. I mean, the majority of COVID deaths were in nursing homes in the US anyway. So we will be that population. You and I will be that population soon enough. So we are out-aging our healthcare system, and we have to address that globally, not just in the US.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, that was the real shock with the COVID-19. The nursing homes, and also the individuals, the populations that had the least access to the healthcare and couldn't afford the quarantining, the social distancing. They are the essential workers. I'm curious too. you're talking about the being able to share the message that this does work. Sounds like there's a good opportunity to bring some of these executives that you're working with together to, and I know this is not your first rodeo. You've heard of the term masterminding before. And is that an opportunity then to bring some of these leaders together to mastermind with other people who are still struggling, or they have questions? How did you do this? What happened here? What if we did this? Is that happening? Do you see that happening?
I see some of it happening. I don't see enough of it happening, and I can speculate as to why. But again, I think it comes back to the fact that we are in the relatively early stages of the evolution of this thing I call smart sourcing, at least within healthcare. There's another way, however, to approach this, and I'm glad you brought up this notion of a leader mastermind. Because it's not just healthcare leaders. I think healthcare leaders can look to leaders in other industries that have already done this. I mean, clearly in manufacturing, smart sourcing has been the case for many, many years. So we can look to how other industries are moving in this direction and use some of those examples. In the book, I talk about Visa International and Dee Hock, the sort of the founder and the mastermind behind Visa International, how he built this coalition of competitors. And we need to do the same thing, I think, within healthcare. We need that equivalent sort of visionary leadership. And so far, I haven't seen that, but I'm holding out hope that we will. And as these leaders begin to become more vocal about the direction they're taking with smart sourcing, it will become a little bit easier for other leaders to sort of follow suit. But we've done this before in other industries. Again, Visa being a great example in banking, hugely regulated. Banks used to operate state by state. They still do, obviously, in many ways, but credit cards were very limited because of that. Bank of America, back when Visa was first being formed, was sending out fully functional credit cards, not just an application, but an actual functional credit card by the hundreds of thousands to people. It was a crazy, messed up industry. And Dee Hock came in and I think created an enormous sense of common purpose and common vision. We need that in healthcare too. And we need that, I think, from the private sector, from hospital leaders that will stand up and say, hey, here's how we did it. Here's how we can move forward as an industry. And we'll start to see some of that, I'm sure.
Okay. Now, there is another 200-pound gorilla in the room. It's called the government.
Yes.
How do we deal with them?
Yeah. So look, in the book, I very purposefully made it apolitical. I didn't go down any particular path in terms of what government's involvement should be or can be. I did make the point, and I talk about historically how we've gotten to where we are from FDR to the present day. And part of what I point out in the book is that policy, as useful as it can be, often has many unintended consequences. And I think we have to be careful of leading with policy. Policy, I think, should follow much of what I'm talking about in the book. So when we begin to weed out the administrative friction, when we begin to right the ship, then we can look at how policy can keep it afloat. But if you try to use policy as a method to patch up the hull while you're sinking, it never seems to work. It always ends up being some sort of compromise by committee. And unfortunately, the unintended consequences of it can end up being pretty severe. I talk in the book about how coming out of World War II, one of the unintended consequences at that point of trying to give employers tax breaks for paying for insurance, health insurance, was that employees forgot what health insurance cost. The employer was underwriting it. So we all have health insurance. We figured, well, we don't need health insurance for everyone since we have it as those who are employed. So policy is great to a point, but I think it should always follow a rational approach to any business. And healthcare is a business. We don't like to say that. It's a different business. It clearly deals with people's lives. It has to be a more humane business than other businesses are necessarily. But nonetheless, it still is a business. And we should look at it that way and figure out how we can fix that business before we begin to rely on government.
Fair enough. With the book, the first step, go read the book.
Absolutely. And you know what? I wrote the book to be read, by the way. A lot of these healthcare books are written in a way that, you'd have to be an MD or a clinician to understand them. I wrote the book so that it would be accessible to a patient. So absolutely read the book, number one.
It's funny. I actually love books like this. And I remember when I was in school years ago, there was this big, thick book that called Social Transformation of Modern Medicine. They took you from the Middle Ages to where we got to today. At that time, we were up to the HMO period, the PPO period. But it's so obvious things cannot continue to go down the same path because things are getting more expensive. I pay for my own insurance. I don't have a healthcare provider, and that worries me how sick do I have to be to get affordable health care? Okay, or how sick do I have to be to actually pursue getting health care, knowing that it's really, at the end of the day, still not affordable? If I get the book, read the book, I start to, read some of the suggestions, and here's how you get started. What does that plan look like for an organization, like a 1 year down the path, 5 years, and 10 years? What does that begin to look like for you?
So, you know what? That's a great question, actually, because I think a lot of providers who consider the approaches I talk about in the book are going to ask that same question. How long will it take to do this? In the conversations I had in writing the book and in looking at hospitals that have done this, that have moved down this path, it's a 5-year path to get to the point where you start to see significant, sustainable savings. That's not to say that you won't see initial savings. You will. John Muir Health claims that they're going to see incredible savings in the first couple of years as a result of their smart sourcing. But to be conservative and I think to be fully aware of the possibilities of things that might come up that are unexpected, give it 5 years to get to the point where you can really build a sustainable model that is leveraging smart sourcing correctly. By the way, you talked about EDS earlier, which was started by Ross Perot. I had worked with Ross for many, many years, and my introduction to healthcare was actually through Perot Systems, because they were working directly with hospital providers in the early 2000s and mid 2000s around this notion of smart sourcing. And I wrote a book. It was when I was working with Ross that I wrote the book Smartsourcing. This is going back now 13 years. And I wrote the book back then because it dawned on me that this idea of partnering in a smart way and having skin in the game and innovating together would work in a variety of industries. What didn't occur to me at that time was how important it would be to healthcare. 13 years later, I was at smart sourcing and how it had caught storm and how everyone was doing it except for healthcare. And I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here? One of the areas where we most need it, and it's not being applied. But that 5-year horizon can be a little, it can put people off sometimes. It sounds like a long time. It's not to say that you won't realize benefits in the interim, but I think to be conservative and to take an approach to this which is not Pollyannish, give it 5 years. But that means that within 10 years, if we made a sincere effort to use this approach, we could really turn the healthcare system around completely through smart sourcing.
Excellent. I'm curious too. At the community hospital level, and again with COVID-19, and as people are trying to get back to work, and definitely you see it in the South. I lived in Alabama when I was with EDS, working with state Medicaid as a provider relations representative. So helping to build the claims, and that's the time we were going from handwritten claims and electronic claim submission was just starting to take off. So you've got these community hospitals that are going away. The ones that still exist, that are continuing to function, maybe less services, are they still in a position to take advantage of what you have in the book? Or do they need like a local partnership? Do they need a big brother partnership to keep that community hospital going?
So I think that for those hospitals specifically, they need to look to partner with larger, more established organizations that can absorb some of the near-term uncertainty. So going back to your earlier question, how long will it take? If you partner with someone local, with a smaller organization to achieve the smart sourcing objectives, I think there's a little too much risk there for most smaller community hospitals to absorb. Partnering with a larger organization, one that has the resources and the long-term vision to ride this out, and to mitigate some of that near-term uncertainty, perhaps take more of it on to themselves from the provider, I think is absolutely the way to go. So my counsel to these, without necessarily naming who that partner should be, because there are a handful of them out there, not many, but a few, I would look to larger organizations to partner with as the smart sourcing provider, so that they can absorb some of that uncertainty, and they have the resources and the blueprint to do it in the fastest manner possible. The last thing you want is to be sort of trying to define what the problem is as you're trying to solve it. And these larger organizations like the ones that John Muir Healthcare has worked with, they've defined the problem, they get it, they understand it, they've got clinicians on staff, so they can partner instantaneously with the hospital. And that's the kind of relationship that you need.
Fantastic. Tom, I don't necessarily want to put you on the spot, but what the heck? We have a feature on our show because we're a Success Insight podcast. We call it Insight to Go. And Insight to Go is some parting word, suggestion, advice, feedback that you would like to leave with our audience. Some, besides getting the book, visiting your websites, and we're going to talk about what those are shortly, what would be your insight to go?
So my simple insight to go is that this is a solvable problem, and it is a problem that we actually understand fairly well in so many other industries, and we should not give healthcare a pass because it is quote unquote different. Every industry I've ever talked to says the same thing. That won't work for us because we're different. You are, but that's not an excuse, right? People pull that line as though they're pulling the ace of spades out of their pocket. Yes, you're different, but that's not an excuse. You don't get a pass. And look, things like COVID-19 won't give us a pass. We've got to be ready to absorb a lot more uncertainty as we get older. If we want healthcare that's going to work in the U.S. or any place else, then we can no longer give healthcare a pass. Yeah, it's different, but yes, it's got to change.
Fantastic. And that is spot on. And that statement, we're different. I've heard that before.
It's a staple. It's a staple.
It's the go-to. So, Tom,
that's right.
It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. If our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, get connected with you, where are the best places for them to go?
My company site is delphigroup.com, and my personal site is tkspeaks.com. Either one of those, they'll find plenty of information about both Delphi and myself.
Fantastic. And you're also on LinkedIn. So we'll provide links back to TK Speaks, Delphi Group, as well as your LinkedIn profile. And of course, we'll provide links back to Amazon so folks can pick up a copy of the book.
Thank you, Howard. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Tom Koulopoulos. Tom is the chairman of the Delphi Group, and he is the author of really just an amazing book. And I have to say, if healthcare, technology, disruption in the workplace is of interest to you, this is a fantastic book, and I would encourage you to pick up a copy. Reimagining Healthcare, How the Smartsourcing Revolution Will Drive the Future of Healthcare and Refocus It on What Matters Most, the patient. And the book was published actually just this past May, so congratulations, Tom. And it was published by Post Hill Press. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Please visit us on successinsightpodcast.com. Do leave a comment for this particular episode or any other episode for that matter. We'll also have a link to this podcast on our LinkedIn company page, Success Insight Podcast, our Facebook page, Success Insight Podcast, and then we are also on the major podcast channels, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio, as well as our YouTube channel. So great conversation today, and we really appreciate Tom taking time out of his weekend, because I'm sure in the week he doesn't work on the weekends. I'm sure of that. But weekdays, busy guy. So we really appreciate Tom taking time out to join us. All right, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, stay safe and go out there still and have a phenomenal day. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.